You've probably had this moment more times than you can count. You sit down, maybe late at night, maybe early in the morning when everything feels quiet and possible, and you think, this time I'm serious. This time I'm actually going to follow through. You make a plan, you feel motivated, clear even, and then something shifts. A few days later, that clarity disappears. The plan starts to feel heavy. You hesitate, you delay, you distract yourself, and eventually you end up right back in that familiar, frustrating place where you're asking yourself, why do I keep doing this? Not because you don't care, but because something inside you isn't aligning with the plan you're trying to follow. If this kind of psychology-based content helps you understand yourself in ways you haven't been able to before, I subscribe. Because this channel is built for people who are tired of surface-level advice and want to actually understand what's going on underneath. Because what you're dealing with here isn't a lack of discipline, and it's not a lack of ambition either. It's something deeper. Most people think the problem is that they don't have a good enough strategy. So they keep searching, new systems, new productivity hacks, new routines. But what if the real problem isn't that your strategy is bad, and it's that your strategy is not designed for the version of you that actually has to execute it? Because there's a quiet mismatch happening. The version of you that creates goals is not the same version of you that has to follow through on them. And until you understand that, every plan you make will feel like it's slowly falling apart, even when it looks perfect on paper. One way to understand this is to think about how your brain handles future thinking versus present action. When you set goals, you're usually in a state of clarity. You're calm, reflective, maybe even a little inspired. Your mind is thinking long-term. It's imagining outcomes, progress, a better version of yourself. In that state, everything feels logical. But when it comes time to act, you're not in that same state anymore. Now you're dealing with stress, distractions, emotional resistance, low energy, uncertainty, and your brain is no longer prioritizing long-term goals, it's prioritizing immediate comfort. Psychology suggests that your mind is constantly trying to reduce perceived threat and discomfort. Not just physical threat, but emotional friction too. So when a task feels overwhelming, unclear, or even slightly uncomfortable, your brain quietly shifts you away from it. Not because you're lazy, but because your nervous system is interpreting that action as something to avoid. This is why you can want something deeply and still not move toward it. Your conscious mind is saying, this matters, but your internal system is saying, this doesn't feel safe, clear, or manageable right now. And here's where most strategies fail. They're built for the motivated version of you, not the resistant one. They assume consistency without accounting for fluctuation. They rely on willpower instead of design. So when your energy drops, or your emotions shift, or your environment changes, which the strategy collapses, not because you failed, but because it was never built to support you in that state. And that's the part no one really explains. You don't need a more intense strategy. You need a more compatible one. Because the truth is, your behavior is always making sense at some level. Even when it looks like self-sabotage, even when it feels irrational, there's usually a pattern underneath it, a loop, a way your mind has learned to protect you, regulate you, or conserve energy. So instead of asking, why can't I stick to my goals? A more useful question might be, what is my current system actually optimized for? Because right now, your life is already running on a strategy. It just might not be one you consciously chose. Maybe it's optimized for avoiding overwhelm. Maybe it's optimized for staying comfortable. Maybe it's optimized for not risking failure or judgment. And once you start seeing it that way, something shifts. You stop seeing yourself as broken, and you start seeing yourself as someone whose internal system is doing exactly what it was trained to do, which means it can be retrained, but not through force, through understanding, because the goal isn't to fight your psychology, it's to work with it. And that requires a different kind of strategy, not one that looks impressive, but one that actually functions in real life. So instead of building a strategy that depends on motivation, you build one that survives without it. Instead of creating a plan that assumes perfect consistency, you create one that adapts to fluctuation. Instead of setting goals that live in your head, you design systems that exist in your environment. And this is where things start to become practical. Because there are a few shifts that can completely change how you approach your goals, without making your life feel like a constant uphill battle. The first shift is this. Stop building strategies around outcomes, and start building them around behaviors that feel doable on your worst days, not your best days, your worst ones, because that's where consistency is actually tested. If your plan only works when you feel motivated, and it's not a real plan, it's a temporary burst of clarity. So instead of asking, what's the ideal version of this? Ask, what's the minimum version I can repeat even when I don't feel like it? because repetition builds identity, and identity drives behavior. The second shift is learning how to reduce friction before you try to increase effort. Most people try to push themselves harder, but your brain responds much better to making things easier. One way to understand this is that your mind is constantly scanning for the path of least resistance. So if your goal requires too many steps, too much decision-making, or too much emotional energy, you're going to avoid it, not consciously, but automatically. So instead of relying on discipline, you redesign the environment. You make the first step obvious. You remove unnecessary choices. You lower the barrier to starting, because starting is often the hardest part. And once you begin, momentum can carry you further than motivation ever could. The third shift is understanding your emotional patterns instead of ignoring them, because your emotions are not interruptions to your strategy. They are part of the system. If you tend to procrastinate when something feels overwhelming, that's not a flaw. It's a signal. It's your mind saying, this feels too big, too unclear, or too risky. So instead of pushing through that feeling blindly, you respond to it. You break the task down, you make it more specific, you reduce the uncertainty, because clarity reduces resistance, and when resistance drops, action becomes easier. The fourth shift is creating feedback loops that actually reinforce progress, not just big wins, but small ones. Because your brain learns through reinforcement. If your progress feels invisible, your motivation fades. But if you can see movement, even in small ways, your brain starts to associate the behavior with reward. And that matters more than you think, because motivation is not just something you start with. And it's something that gets built through experience. And finally, the shift that ties all of this together. Stop treating your goals like a test of your worth, because the moment your goals become tied to your identity in that way, every failure feels personal. Every delay feels like proof that something is wrong with you, and that creates pressure, and pressure creates avoidance. So instead of approaching your goals like something you have to prove, approach them like something you're learning how to do, because learning allows room for mistakes. It allows adjustment. It allows growth. And more importantly, it allows you to keep going without turning every setback into a reason to stop. When you build a strategy from this place, so everything starts to feel different. Not easier in the sense that there's no effort, but easier in the sense that you're no longer fighting yourself. You're working with your patterns, your energy, your psychology, and that's where real consistency comes from. Not from forcing yourself into a system that looks good on paper, but from creating one that actually fits the way you function. So if you've been feeling stuck, if you've been starting and stopping, if you've been questioning your discipline or your ability to follow through, maybe the answer isn't to try harder. Maybe it's to build smarter, to understand yourself more deeply, to design a strategy that doesn't collapse the moment life feels heavy. Because you don't need a perfect plan, you need a sustainable one. And once you have that, progress stops feeling like something you're chasing and starts feeling like something you're steadily building. And if you want to go deeper into understanding the patterns that keep pulling you off track, there's another video that breaks down exactly how these loops form and how to break them. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you don't just change your actions, you change the system behind them. And that's where everything begins to shift.